The courtroom was packed. Cold white light from the ceiling lamps shone down, reflecting off the tense faces of dozens of victims who were watching the nationally broadcast trial. No one spoke, only the faint whir of the cameras broke the silence, as if history itself was being recorded. The heavy doors swung open. Lucas Reed walked in, wearing the light-colored suit, a perfectly straight tie, and a smug smile that made it seem like this was his stage, not a courtroom. He used to be praised by the media as America's tech genius, the founder of a leading technology corporation, the man who redefined the future. But today, he stood before justice, accused of financial fraud and the exploitation of hundreds of poor workers, most of them people of color. Whispers filled the air as he sat down at the defendant's bench. He did not bother to look around. He just smiled faintly, as if watching a cheap performance. Then the other door opened, and the entire room fell silent. The clerk's voice rang out clearly. "Please rise, Judge Kendra Owens presiding." Everyone stood up except one man. Lucas remained seated, his hands clasped together, eyes full of defiance. "I do not stand for anyone," he said softly, just loud enough for the microphone to catch it, especially not for someone like her. The entire courtroom froze. The air grew so thick that everyone could hear their own heartbeat. The camera panned slowly to Judge Owens, a black woman with calm eyes. Lips pressed together, her face showing not a single hint of reaction. She looked at him for a few seconds, then said quietly, her voice steady, "The court acknowledges the defendant's behavior. Proceed." No rebuke, no raised voice, not even a frown. Just a simple sentence, yet it made the entire room hold its breath. Because everyone understood that calmness was not weakness. It was the quiet strength of justice standing before raw arrogance. Under the cold light, two gazes met, one filled with pride and power, the other with unshakable resolve. And no one knew that this very moment was the beginning of a confrontation that would grip an entire nation. Lucas Reed, the name that once made the tech world bow its head. By the age of 35, he was already a millionaire, the owner of a multi-billion-dollar company with the noble-sounding slogan, "Technology for the future of humanity." On television, he always appeared in sharp suits, flashing a confident smile and delivering speeches that made crowds erupt in applause. But behind that glamorous image was another truth, a system built on sweat, tears, and exploitation, especially of people of color and those born into hardship. Poor workers labored for 14 hours a day, or about 22 kilometers per hour if you counted time by exhaustion in harsh conditions. Without insurance, and often unpaid. Anyone who dared to speak up was fired, threatened, or smeared in the media. Lucas had the best lawyers, powerful connections, and an unshakable belief that money could silence any truth. In one interview, he laughed and said, "In this world, the strong win, the weak, they are born to serve." In stark contrast stood Judge Kendra Owens, a black woman who grew up in a poor working-class neighborhood in Atlanta. Her mother was a housekeeper, her father, a mechanic. She knew what injustice felt like. She knew what it meant to be looked down upon because of the color of her skin. That was why she chose the path of law, guided by one unbreakable belief. Justice does not serve power, it serves the truth. And then there were people like Jamal Carter, a former engineer at Lucas's company who was fired after daring to expose internal fraud. Or Tasha Green, a single mother who lost her home when Lucas's corporation declared a fake bankruptcy to avoid debt. They were small faces in a cold, massive system until the day this courtroom opened. As for Lucas, he still smiled, still believed this was nothing more than a little political show. Because to him, justice was just a concept for the poor, and that arrogance was about to cost him dearly. From the very first days of the trial, Lucas Reed turned the courtroom into his personal stage. He leaned back in his chair, hands in his pockets, smirking whenever the prosecutor spoke. At times, he even interrupted the arguments mid-sentence, his voice dripping with contempt. "Excuse me," he said once, "but I have heard enough of this cheap moral preaching." The courtroom fell silent, Cameras zoomed in on his proud, mocking face. Every testimony from the witnesses was met with his laughter. When one former employee stood up and said he had been forced to work 16 hours a day, which is about 26 kilometers per hour in human endurance, Lucas burst out laughing and muttered, "He should thank me for giving him a job." But the peak came on the third morning of the trial. When Judge Owens asked him to maintain proper conduct, Lucas turned to her, smiled mockingly, and said each word clearly. "Madam Activist, you should be giving speeches instead of sitting on that bench." A phrase laced with disdain, an insult not just to her as a person, but to her race and the ideals she represented. The courtroom turned to stone. But Owens did not respond. She simply looked at him, her eyes calm, her voice steady in the stillness. "Your attitude has been noted. This court will let your actions speak for themselves." Then she did something few judges would dare. She allowed the victims to stand and tell their stories in their own voices. Without lawyers, without interruption, one by one, trembling voices filled the room. Jamal spoke about the threats. Tasha described the night she held her child and slept on the sidewalk after losing her home. Tears fell. The entire courtroom was silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing, the kind that carries pain and truth. Only Lucas remained leaned back, tapping his fingers on the table, smirking. But at that very moment, Judge Owens's eyes changed. They were no longer just calm. There was something deeper in them, like a storm quietly gathering strength. In the days that followed, the courtroom grew heavier and heavier, the kind of tension that made every breath feel weighted. Each morning, Lucas Reed walked in with that same arrogant smile. But little by little, that look of victory began to fade as fragments of truth surfaced before the public. The prosecutor started calling witnesses. A young engineer, his face still marked with exhaustion, stood up and testified that he had been forced to sign fake contracts to cover up unpaid wages. "We were threatened," he said, voice trembling. "If we refused to sign, we would be fired immediately." Then came a middle-aged accountant, holding a laptop. He projected an internal company email onto the screen. Lucas's signature appeared clearly beneath a cold, direct order. "Delete the real data, replace it with the numbers the investors want to see." Gasps filled the room. Some reporters could not help themselves. They stood up, scribbling furiously. Lucas forced a smirk, pretending to remain calm, but his hands clenched tighter, fingers tapping anxiously on the wooden table. The climax came when the prosecutor played a secret audio recording, captured during a private party Lucas had attended. Never realizing someone had been recording, the sound echoed through the courtroom, soft background music, laughter, and then Lucas's voice, clear, confident, dripping with disdain. "I do not care who they are. They work. I pay. If they are weak, they get replaced. Simple. And do not forget, they need me. Not the other way around." The room went dead silent. No sound of pens tapping, no camera flashes. Tasha Green broke down in tears. Jamal Carter bowed his head, hands trembling in silence. Some people in the audience collapsed into their seats, faces buried in their palms, as if they had just heard the naked confession of a soulless system. Lucas looked around. The smirk vanished from his face. For the first time, he felt small, surrounded by hundreds of eyes, the very people he once called the bottom of society. Judge Owens lifted her gavel. 3 clear knocks, bang, 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 sliced through the thick air of emotion. Her voice was slow and deliberate, each word carved into the memory of everyone present. "This court will recess. When we return, justice will speak." Lucas stood, trying to keep his composure, but fear flickered in his eyes, a fear he himself could not name. Outside, reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his face. Headlines soon rolled across national television. "Tech genius or modern-day exploiter?" Lucas Reed's empire shaken by the weight of justice. Inside, Judge Owens sat alone before the files. She closed her eyes for a moment. No smile touched her lips, only a long, heavy breath. To her, this was more than a trial. It was the memory of a generation that had been looked down upon. stepped on, and silenced, now reclaiming its voice. As the last rays of sunlight slipped through the courtroom window, everyone knew the trial was entering its final stage, where arrogance would finally face a judgment no amount of money could buy. On the day of the verdict, the sky was gray and heavy. Light rain fell across the stone steps of the federal courthouse. Reporters crowded both sides of the entrance, cameras flashing non-stop. Lucas Reed stepped out of a luxury car, wearing a white trench coat and his familiar confident smile. He turned toward the cameras and spoke as if it were just another press conference. "I guess today will be quick. I have faith in the system." Inside, the tension was palpable. Judge Kendra Owens sat silently, a thick stack of papers before her, the result of 3 long months of relentless trial. Everyone waited for her to speak. Lucas straightened his tie, leaned back, and smiled smugly when he saw the cameras turned his way. He whispered to his lawyer, "She will say a few emotional words and find me. That is it. They always fear power." But then the gavel struck. Judge Owens's voice broke the fragile silence, calm, firm, and unshakable. "Lucas Reed, this court finds you guilty on all 27 counts, including financial fraud, forced labor, and falsifying statements to investors." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lucas tried to maintain his composure, his lips twitching, but the judge continued, her voice cold and sharp as steel. "You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, without parole. All of your assets, shares, and investment funds will be seized to compensate your victims." The sound drained from the room. Then came the wave, soft murmurs, gasps, and finally, a surge of restrained applause that grew louder and louder. Lucas jumped to his feet, shouting, voice cracking with rage and disbelief, "You cannot do this. I am Lucas Reed. I built an empire." Judge Owens did not rise. She simply looked at him, not with anger, but with unwavering certainty. "Before the law, you are simply a citizen who broke it. And no one, not wealth, not power, stands above the law." Her gavel came down one final time. Court is adjourned. 2 officers approached and cuffed Lucas's wrists. He struggled and shouted, but his voice drowned beneath the thunder of applause from the very people he once crushed. Jamal wept. Tasha held her son, trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming truth that, for the first time in years, justice had truly prevailed. When the courtroom doors closed, Judge Owens remained seated alone. She stared at the wooden gavel still vibrating slightly on the table. Then she closed her eyes and sighed, not from exhaustion but from understanding, because that day she had not only sentenced a man, she had sentenced a belief, the belief that money could buy everything, even justice. A month after the historic verdict, media outlets across America declared it the trial that changed how we see justice. Major newspapers featured Judge Kendra Owens, the black woman sitting resolutely behind the bench, with the headline, "Justice does not fear power." From that trial, change spread faster than anyone expected. Technology companies were forced to make their finances transparent. Small labor organizations began to form, protecting workers who had once suffered in silence. Jamal Carter, the engineer who had been fired for telling the truth, became the founder of a nonprofit organization called the Owens Initiative, a legal aid fund for underprivileged workers. At his first press conference, he said, "We named it after Judge Owens because she proved that justice has no color. It belongs to everyone who dares to stand up." And Tasha Green, the mother who once lost her home, wrote a handwritten letter to the court. One line in that letter made an entire newsroom break down in tears. "You did not just punish the guilty, you helped people like me believe in justice again." In the final scene, the camera drifted toward the window of Judge Owens's office. She sat quietly, the evening light filtering through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow across her calm face. On the desk, the wooden gavel remained, a symbol of duty, truth, and courage. Justice has no color, it has no price. It exists only when there are people brave enough to protect it. The screen slowly faded to black, and the final words appeared. If you believe justice must be protected by all of us, share this story. Because silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of complicity.